A 9-year-old girl calls 911 after hearing her mother screaming for help from the locked basement. When police arrive and break down the door, what they find makes them immediately arrest the girl's stepfather. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, its deep bronze voice echoing through the pristine corridors of the Ashford house like a funeral bell. Rebecca pressed her small face against the cool glass of her bedroom window, watching the October rain streak down in rivulets that reminded her of tears. The droplets caught the amber glow from the street lamps, creating tiny prisons of light that shattered and reformed with each new cascade. Everything about this house felt wrong tonight, though Rebecca couldn't put her finger on why. It was the same colonial-style home they had lived in for 3 years, with its perfectly manicured lawn and white picket fence that made all the neighbors in Westfield whisper about what a lovely family the Ashfords were. But tonight, the walls seemed to press closer, and the shadows in the corners stretched longer than they should. "Rebecca? Sweetheart, dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Caroline's voice drifted up from the kitchen, carrying that particular strain that had become as familiar as background music over the past 6 months. Ever since David had moved in, Mama's voice had developed this brittle quality, like glass that might shatter if someone spoke too loudly. Rebecca slid down from the window seat, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She had learned to move quietly in this house, another change that had crept in gradually, like winter. Before David, she and Mama used to laugh loudly at silly television shows, dance in the kitchen while making pancakes, and sing off-key songs in the car. Now, laughter felt dangerous, as if it might disturb something sleeping in the walls. The 9-year-old padded down the hallway, past the framed photographs that told the story of their transformed family. The older pictures showed Rebecca and Caroline with Thomas. Dear, wonderful Daddy Thomas, who had taught Rebecca how to ride a bicycle and read her bedtime stories until she was far too old for them. In those photographs, Mama's smile reached her eyes, crinkling them at the corners with genuine joy. The newer photographs featured David. Rebecca paused in front of one taken just last month at the Harvest Festival. David's arm was wrapped possessively around Caroline's waist, his other hand resting on Rebecca's shoulder with what everyone else probably saw as fatherly affection. But Rebecca remembered how his fingers had pressed just a little too hard against her collarbone, and how his smile never quite matched his eyes. In the photograph, Mama looked beautiful but hollow, like a porcelain doll that someone had forgotten to paint a soul into. "My 2 favorite girls," David would say whenever he looked at that picture. And something in his tone always made Rebecca's stomach twist into uncomfortable knots. The kitchen was warm and filled with the aroma of Caroline's famous beef stew. But even the familiar comfort of home cooking couldn't chase away the peculiar tension that seemed to thicken the air. Caroline stood at the stove, stirring the pot with mechanical precision, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed the sharp angles of her increasingly gaunt face. She had lost weight since the wedding, weight she couldn't afford to lose. "Where's David?" Rebecca asked, settling into her usual chair at the kitchen table. The wood was old and scarred from years of family meals, each mark telling a story of spilled juice and homework sessions and birthday celebrations. "He's downstairs with a client," Caroline replied without turning around. "Mr. Patterson is having some family difficulties, and David wanted to fit him in for an emergency session." Rebecca nodded, though something about this explanation sat uneasily in her mind. David saw his therapy clients in the basement office he had constructed shortly after moving in. He had explained to Rebecca that many people felt more comfortable in a private, separate space when discussing their personal problems, and that the basement provided the perfect environment for healing conversations. But Rebecca had noticed things. She had excellent hearing, a trait that had gotten her in trouble more than once when she repeated conversations she wasn't supposed to have overheard. Lately, she had been hearing strange sounds from the basement during David's sessions. Not the quiet murmur of conversation she would expect, but sometimes crying, sometimes what sounded like arguing. And once, she could have sworn she heard someone pounding on the walls. When she had mentioned this to Caroline, her mother had gotten that distant look in her eyes and explained that therapy could be very emotional, and that people sometimes needed to express their feelings in physical ways. "David is helping them work through their trauma," Caroline had said, but her voice had sounded like she was reading from a script. "Mama," Rebecca said carefully. Do you remember when Daddy Thomas used to help people with their problems? Caroline's hand stilled on the wooden spoon. Thomas had indeed been a counselor, a gentle, patient man who worked with children who had experienced trauma. But he had worked at a clinic downtown with proper oversight and other professionals nearby. He had never brought his work home, never locked himself away in basements with distressed clients. That was different, sweetheart, Caroline said finally. David has a different approach. He believes in intensive, private sessions. Rebecca wanted to ask more questions, but she recognized the tone in her mother's voice that meant the subject was closed. It was another new rule in their house. There were topics that simply couldn't be discussed, questions that couldn't be asked, observations that couldn't be shared. The basement door was located just off the kitchen, painted white to match the rest of the trim, but somehow managing to look more ominous than any door had a right to. A small sign hung at eye level, "Session in progress. Do not disturb." David had installed a complex lock system, explaining that client confidentiality required absolute privacy. Even Caroline wasn't allowed downstairs during sessions. As if summoned by her thoughts, Rebecca heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Heavy, deliberate steps that she had learned to recognize as David's particular rhythm. The lock clicked and turned, and David emerged into the kitchen like an actor stepping onto a stage. "How are my beautiful ladies this evening?" he asked, his voice carrying that warm, professional tone he used with everyone. David was handsome in a carefully maintained way, tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair that suggested wisdom and kind eyes that suggested compassion. He looked exactly like what someone would want in a stepfather and therapist, trustworthy, stable, protective. Rebecca had learned not to trust first impressions. "Mr. Patterson seemed quite upset when he arrived," Caroline said, accepting David's kiss on her cheek with the passive compliance of someone who had forgotten how to refuse affection. "Sometimes the road to healing requires walking through very dark places first," David replied, washing his hands at the kitchen sink with the thoroughness of a surgeon. "But I believe we made significant progress tonight." Rebecca watched him dry his hands, noting how his movements were precise and controlled. Everything David did was measured and purposeful, as if he were constantly performing for an invisible audience. Even his spontaneous moments felt rehearsed. "How was school today, Rebecca?" David asked, settling into the chair that had once been Thomas's. "Did you finish that history report on the colonial period?" "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied, though she wanted to correct him. The report was actually on the Revolutionary War, and she had finished it 2 days ago. David often got small details about her life wrong, despite his claims of being deeply invested in her well-being. It was as if he were playing the role of an attentive stepfather without actually listening to the lines. "Excellent. Education is so important for young minds. Your mother and I want nothing but the best for your future." The way he said "your mother and I" made it sound like they were a unit that had naturally formed, rather than a relationship that had developed with startling speed. Rebecca remembered how quickly David had gone from being a stranger to being a permanent fixture in their lives. The courtship had been intense and brief. Flowers every day, romantic dinners, weekend trips that left Caroline glowing with happiness for the first time since Thomas's death. But happiness and relief weren't the same thing, Rebecca had begun to realize. Mama had been grateful for David's attention, grateful for his stability, grateful for his willingness to take on a widow with a young daughter. Gratitude, however, could be a dangerous foundation for love. "Rebecca has been having some interesting dreams lately," Caroline said as she served the stew, and Rebecca felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She shot her mother a pleading look, but Caroline seemed determined to share this particular piece of information. "Oh," David's voice carried a note of professional interest that made Rebecca's skin crawl. "Would you like to tell me about these dreams, sweetheart?" Rebecca absolutely did not want to tell David about her dreams, which had been growing increasingly vivid and disturbing over the past few weeks. In them, she was much younger, sometimes just a baby, and there was a man who looked like David but somehow different, angrier. In the dreams, this man was shouting at Caroline, and Caroline was crying, and there was always a sense of terrible danger that Rebecca couldn't quite understand. "They're just silly nightmares," Rebecca mumbled, focusing intently on her dinner. Dreams can be very revealing, David continued, his therapist voice in full effect. They often represent our subconscious mind trying to process difficult emotions or memories. Perhaps we should schedule some time to discuss them in more detail. The idea of being alone with David in his basement office made Rebecca's appetite disappear entirely. She had been down there exactly once, when David had first shown them his healing space. The room had been painted in soothing colors and filled with comfortable furniture, but something about it had made Rebecca feel claustrophobic. The walls seemed too thick, the windows too small, and the door too heavy. It felt less like a therapy office and more like a very comfortable prison. "I don't think that's necessary," Caroline said quickly, and Rebecca felt a rush of relief and gratitude toward her mother. Rebecca has been seeing Dr. Vance for over a year now, and they have a good therapeutic relationship. For just a moment, David's mask slipped, and Rebecca caught a glimpse of something cold and calculating in his expression. But the moment passed so quickly that she almost convinced herself she had imagined it. "Of course," David said smoothly. "I wouldn't want to interfere with an established therapeutic relationship. Though I do hope that if Rebecca ever feels comfortable enough to share her concerns with me, she knows that I'm here for her." Rebecca nodded politely, though every instinct in her body was screaming that she should never, ever be alone with David in that basement room. She couldn't articulate why. He had never said or done anything overtly threatening, but something primal in her brain recognized danger when it saw it. The rest of dinner passed in the kind of strained conversation that had become normal in their household. David dominated the discussion with stories from his practice, carefully anonymized, he always emphasized, and plans for upcoming family activities that sounded wonderful in theory but somehow felt more like obligations than celebrations. As Caroline began clearing the dishes, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He read it quickly, his expression shifting to one of professional concern. "I'm afraid I need to go downstairs for another session," he announced. "Mrs. Henderson is having a crisis and needs immediate intervention." Rebecca found this odd, since she was certain she had heard David's client leave through the basement's exterior door over an hour ago. The basement had been designed with its own entrance so that clients could come and go without disturbing the family upstairs. Another one of David's innovations that made perfect sense in theory but felt unsettling in practice. "This late?" Caroline asked, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 8:30, well past normal business hours. "Mental health crises don't adhere to conventional schedules," David replied, his tone gentle but firm. "I may be down there for several hours. Please don't wait up for me." He kissed Caroline goodbye, ruffled Rebecca's hair with practiced affection, and disappeared back through the basement door. The lock clicked into place with a finality that always made Rebecca think of prison doors closing. "I think I'll do some reading before bed," Caroline said, but her voice sounded hollow and distant. She had been doing a lot of reading lately, thick psychology textbooks that David recommended, self-help books about blended families, articles about childhood trauma that she thought Rebecca didn't know she was researching. Rebecca helped finish cleaning the kitchen, then retreated to her room with homework that she had already completed. The house settled into its evening rhythm, but something felt different tonight. The silence from the basement was too complete, too absolute. Usually, she could hear the faint murmur of conversation, but tonight there was nothing. She tried to focus on a book, but the words seemed to blur together on the page. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and sent dead leaves skittering across the driveway like small, desperate creatures trying to escape. At 9:30, Rebecca heard Caroline's bedroom door close. At 10, the house was officially quiet. At 10:15, Rebecca crept out of her room and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen, drawn by an anxiety she couldn't name. The basement door stood closed and locked, as always. But as Rebecca pressed her ear against the wood, she heard something that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. It was her mother's voice, muffled and distant but unmistakably Caroline's. And she was screaming. Not the controlled emotional release that David had explained was part of the therapeutic process. This was raw, desperate terror, the sound of someone who was in immediate and terrible danger. Rebecca's hand flew to the door handle, but it didn't budge. The lock held firm, as it always did during David's sessions. But this wasn't a session with Mrs. Henderson. This was something else entirely. "Mama," Rebecca whispered against the door, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Mama, I'm here." But the screaming continued, joined now by David's voice. Not the gentle, therapeutic tone he used upstairs, but something harsh and commanding that Rebecca had never heard before. With shaking hands, Rebecca ran to the kitchen phone and dialed the 3 numbers that every child was taught from the earliest age. The numbers that meant help was coming. 911, "What's your emergency?" "My mama," Rebecca whispered into the receiver, hiding in the pantry closet among the boxes of cereal and cans of soup. "She's screaming for help, and she's locked in the basement, and I can't get to her. Sweetheart, I need you to speak up. Can you tell me your name and address?" "Rebecca Ashford, 247 Maple Street in Westfield. Please hurry. Something terrible is happening to my mama." And as she gave the dispatcher her information, whispering into the phone while her mother's terrified screams echoed through the floorboards beneath her feet, Rebecca finally understood that all her instincts had been right. The monster she had sensed lurking in their perfect house hadn't been hiding in the shadows. It had been sitting at their dinner table all along. The 911 dispatcher's voice was steady and professional, cutting through Rebecca's terror like a lifeline thrown into churning waters. "Rebecca, I need you to stay on the phone with me. Can you tell me if anyone else is in the house besides your mother?" "My stepfather David," Rebecca whispered, pressing herself deeper into the pantry closet. The familiar smell of vanilla extract and cinnamon surrounded her, scents that should have been comforting but now felt like the last remnants of a life that was dissolving around her. "He said he was having a session with a client, but I think he lied. I think he's hurting Mama." Through the phone, Rebecca could hear the dispatcher typing rapidly. "Officers are on their way, sweetheart. They'll be there in less than 5 minutes. I need you to stay hidden and stay quiet. Don't try to go downstairs. Okay?" But Rebecca was finding it increasingly difficult to follow that instruction. Caroline's screams had evolved into something worse. Desperate pleading that carried through the floorboards like a prayer to a merciless deity. The words were muffled, but Rebecca could make out fragments. "Please stop," and "I won't tell anyone," and most heartbreakingly, "Think about Rebecca." Her mother was invoking her name like a shield, trying to use Rebecca's existence to appeal to whatever humanity might remain in David. But instead of compassion, David's response was a harsh laugh that sounded nothing like the man who had read Rebecca bedtime stories and helped her with her math homework. "David doesn't care about Rebecca the way you think he does." His voice carried up from the basement, and there was something in his tone that made Rebecca's skin crawl with a recognition she didn't understand. "He cares about her in ways you're finally starting to remember. Aren't you, Caroline?" Rebecca pressed the phone closer to her ear, straining to hear the dispatcher's reassuring voice over the sound of her own heartbeat. But she couldn't block out her mother's response, a wail of anguish that sounded like something breaking inside her soul. "He's my daughter," Caroline sobbed, and Rebecca felt the world tilt on its axis. "She's mine, not yours. You gave up any claim to her when you walked away." The phone nearly slipped from Rebecca's trembling fingers. The words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense. David wasn't her father. Thomas Ashford was her father, the man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and attended every school play and held her when she had nightmares about monsters under the bed. But even as Rebecca's conscious mind rejected what she was hearing, something deeper was stirring. The dreams that had been haunting her for weeks suddenly snapped into sharper focus. The man who looked like David but angrier, shouting at a pregnant Caroline. The sense of abandonment and betrayal that permeated those nocturnal visions. The feeling that she had lived through these moments before, when she was too young to understand their significance. "You remember now, don't you?" David's voice continued, carrying a satisfied tone that made Rebecca feel sick. "You remember what you tried so hard to forget, what you thought you could hide from me forever." "The therapy," Caroline whispered, and her voice carried a note of dawning horror. "The memory treatments. You've been making me remember." Rebecca could hear David moving around in the basement, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Not making you remember, Caroline. Preventing you from forgetting. Do you have any idea how much effort it took to find you again? How many years I spent tracking down my daughter? The word daughter hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She bit down on her knuckle to keep from crying out, tasting blood as her teeth broke the skin. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be happening. But the memories were flooding back now, triggered by the conversation below. Being very small, maybe 3 years old, and hiding behind Caroline's legs while a man who looked like David demanded to see her. Caroline's terrified refusal, her insistence that he had given up any rights when he abandoned them. The man's angry departure, followed by Caroline's desperate phone calls to someone she called Thomas. Dear, sweet Thomas, who had swooped into their lives like a guardian angel and married Caroline within months, adopting Rebecca and giving her his name, creating a legal barrier between Rebecca and the man who had never wanted to be her father in the first place. Until now. The accident wasn't an accident, was it? Caroline's voice was barely audible through the floor, but Rebecca caught every devastating word. Thomas, the car crash. You caused it. David's laughter was cold and satisfied. Thomas Ashford was a complication that needed to be resolved. A weak, sentimental man who thought he could steal my daughter and play house with my family. The brake failure was regrettable but necessary. Rebecca pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to escape. Thomas, the only father she had ever truly known, had been murdered, killed by the man who was now living in their house, sleeping in their beds, eating at their table. The man who had spent months gaining their trust and making them dependent on him. I've been very patient, Caroline, David continued, his voice taking on the measured tone he used during his supposed therapy sessions. I've given you time to adjust, time to remember, time to accept the reality of our situation. But your resistance is becoming problematic. Resistance to what? Caroline asked, though Rebecca could hear that her mother already knew the answer. To acknowledging my rights as Rebecca's father. To accepting that she belongs with me, not with whatever pathetic substitute you might try to find next. To understanding that the three of us are a family, whether you choose to cooperate or not. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by Caroline's ragged breathing. Then, quietly but with unmistakable determination, she spoke. I will never let you have her. Never. The sound that followed was sharp and violent. Skin connecting with skin in a slap that seemed to echo through the entire house. Rebecca flinched as if she had been struck herself, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her mother being punished for trying to protect her. You don't have a choice anymore, David said, his voice returning to that terrifyingly calm professional tone. The treatments have been very effective, haven't they? Your memory is becoming quite unreliable. Soon, you won't be able to trust your own perceptions of reality. The courts will have no choice but to place Rebecca in the care of her stable, loving stepfather when her mother proves to be mentally incompetent. Rebecca felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as the full scope of David's plan became clear. This wasn't just about claiming her as his daughter. It was about systematically destroying Caroline's mind until she was no longer capable of protecting anyone. The insurance money from Thomas's death was quite substantial, David continued conversationally. Combined with your inheritance, Rebecca will be very well provided for. Of course, you won't be around to see how she turns out, but I'm sure you understand that some sacrifices are necessary for the greater good. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. David wasn't just planning to take Rebecca. He was planning to eliminate Caroline entirely once she was no longer useful. You're insane, Caroline whispered. I'm thorough, David corrected. I'm also running out of patience with your dramatics. The next phase of your treatment begins tonight. Rebecca heard the distinctive sound of medical equipment being wheeled across the basement floor, followed by Caroline's renewed struggles and muffled protests. Whatever David was planning to do to her mother, it was something that required restraints and machinery. Rebecca, are you still there? The dispatcher's voice seemed to come from very far away. Yes, Rebecca managed to whisper, though her voice was thick with tears. The officers are pulling up to your house now. I need you to go to the front door and let them in, but move very quietly. Can you do that for me? Rebecca nodded, then realized the dispatcher couldn't see her. Yes, I can do that. She crept out of the pantry closet on shaking legs, the phone still pressed to her ear. The basement door loomed in her peripheral vision, but she forced herself not to look at it. She couldn't help her mother by getting caught now. Her only chance was to bring in people who were stronger than David, people who had the authority to stop whatever was happening in that basement laboratory. The front hallway felt like it stretched for miles, each step on the hardwood floor sounding impossibly loud despite her efforts to move silently. Through the decorative glass panels beside the front door, she could see the flashing red and blue lights of police cars painting the night in urgent colors. Rebecca unlocked the front door with trembling fingers and pulled it open to reveal two police officers. A tall man with graying hair and a shorter woman with kind eyes that immediately focused on Rebecca's tear-stained face. "Are you Rebecca?" the female officer asked, kneeling down to Rebecca's eye level. "I'm Officer Martinez, and this is Officer Thompson. We're here to help your mother." "She's in the basement," Rebecca whispered, pointing toward the kitchen. "David has her locked down there, and she's screaming, and he's doing something terrible to her." Officer Martinez spoke quickly into her radio while Officer Thompson moved toward the kitchen, his hand resting on his weapon. "We need backup and an ambulance at 247 Maple Street. Possible domestic violence situation with potential medical emergency." Rebecca followed the officers to the basement door, her bare feet silent on the tile floor. The house felt different with the police presence, less like a prison and more like a crime scene that was finally being investigated. Officer Thompson tried the basement door handle and found it locked, just as Rebecca had known it would be. "Sir, this is the Westfield Police Department," he called through the door. "We need you to open this door immediately." The response from below was immediate and chilling. The medical equipment stopped humming, Caroline's protests were suddenly muffled, and David's voice called up with perfect composure. "Officers, there seems to be some kind of misunderstanding. I'm Dr. David Brennan, and I'm currently providing emergency psychological treatment to my wife. She's having a severe mental health crisis, and any interruption could be dangerous to her well-being. Sir, we need to see both you and your wife immediately," Officer Martinez called back. "Please unlock the door." "I understand your concern," David replied, his therapist voice in full effect. "But I'm sure you understand that patient confidentiality and safety must be my primary considerations. Caroline is heavily sedated and in a very fragile state. Perhaps we could schedule a time tomorrow when she's more stable." Rebecca watched Officer Thompson's expression harden. "Sir, this door opens now, or we're going to open it for you." There was a long pause from the basement, during which Rebecca held her breath and prayed to whatever forces might be listening that David wouldn't hurt her mother worse before help could reach her. Finally, the lock clicked and turned. The basement door swung open, revealing David in his perfectly pressed shirt and slacks, not a hair out of place. His expression was one of professional concern mixed with mild irritation at the interruption. "Officers, I appreciate your response to what I'm sure seemed like an emergency," David began, but Officer Thompson was already pushing past him toward the basement stairs. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Officer Thompson called down into the basement. Caroline's response was weak but audible. "Help me. Please help me." That was all the officers needed to hear. Officer Martinez spoke rapidly into her radio, calling for additional units and medical personnel, while Officer Thompson disappeared down the basement stairs with his weapon drawn. David's facade finally began to crack. "You don't understand," he said to Officer Martinez, his voice taking on a note of desperate authority. "My wife is mentally ill. She's been having violent episodes and delusional thinking. Rebecca called you because she's frightened and confused, but this is a medical situation, not a criminal one." But Officer Martinez was looking at Rebecca, taking in her pale face and trembling hands and the blood stain on her knuckle where she had bitten herself. "Rebecca, sweetheart, are you hurt?" Rebecca shook her head, finding her voice stronger than she had expected. "He's lying. He's not helping Mama. He's been hurting her for months, and tonight was worse." He said terrible things about my daddy Thomas, and about me, and about making Mama forget things. Rebecca, honey, you're confused, David said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone adults used when they thought children couldn't understand complex situations. Your mother has been very sick, and sometimes sick people say things that aren't true. I've been trying to help her get better. But his words were drowned out by Officer Thompson's voice from the basement. I need that ambulance here now, and get Detective Walsh on the scene immediately. This is not a domestic disturbance. This is a crime scene. David's expression shifted from concerned authority to cold calculation in the space of a heartbeat. For just a moment, Rebecca saw the man from her dreams. The angry stranger who had abandoned her before she was born and who had spent years planning his return. Then Officer Martinez was placing handcuffs on David's wrists while reading him his rights, and Rebecca was being gently led away from the basement door by a victim's advocate who had arrived with the ambulance crew. As paramedics rushed down the basement stairs with their equipment, Rebecca caught one last glimpse of David's face. He was looking directly at her, and his expression wasn't angry or defeated. It was satisfied, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. That look would haunt Rebecca's dreams for years to come, because even at 9 years old, she understood what it meant. David believed he was going to win. Even arrested and handcuffed, even with his crimes exposed, he somehow thought this was just another step in a longer game. And Rebecca was terrified that he might be right. The basement that David had called his healing space revealed itself to be something far more sinister under the harsh glare of police flashlights. Officer Thompson's initial shock had given way to grim professionalism as he documented what could only be described as a makeshift medical laboratory designed for psychological torture. Rebecca sat in the living room with victim's advocate Lisa Stone, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like the patrol car and fighting the urge to run downstairs and see her mother. The house had been transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape cordoned off sections, photographers documented evidence, and detectives moved through rooms that had once felt like home with the methodical precision of people who had seen too much human cruelty. Rebecca, I know this is very scary, Lisa said gently, her voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who specialized in helping children through their worst moments. But I need to ask you some questions about what you've seen and heard in this house. Can you help me understand what's been happening? Rebecca nodded, though her throat felt like it was closing. Through the basement door, she could hear the controlled chaos of the crime scene investigation. Detective Walsh's authoritative voice directing the collection of evidence, the click of cameras, and most heartbreakingly, the gentle murmur of paramedics working on Caroline. The dreams, Rebecca began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been having these dreams for weeks, but I think they were really memories. About David being there when I was very little, before Daddy Thomas. Lisa wrote carefully in her notebook, her expression encouraging Rebecca to continue. What did you see in these dreams? David yelling at Mama when she was pregnant. Him saying he didn't want a baby. Mama crying all the time. Rebecca's hands twisted in the blanket as the suppressed memories crystallized into heartbreaking clarity. Then Thomas came and David went away, and everything was better. But David never really went away, did he? He was just waiting. Through the basement door, Detective Walsh's voice carried up clearly, Jesus Christ, look at this equipment. This isn't therapy. This is systematic psychological torture. Rebecca shuddered, but Lisa placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You're being very brave, Rebecca. I know these are difficult things to remember and talk about. He killed Thomas? Rebecca said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He said the brake failure was regrettable but necessary. Daddy Thomas didn't just die. David murdered him so he could come back and take me. Lisa's pen stilled on the paper, and Rebecca saw something shift in the woman's expression. This wasn't just child welfare anymore. This was multiple homicide with a victim who was still very much alive and in immediate danger. Rebecca, when did you hear David say this about Thomas? Tonight, when Mama was screaming in the basement. He told her that Thomas was a complication that needed to be resolved. Rebecca's voice broke on the words, grief and rage warring in her chest. Thomas was the best daddy in the world, and David killed him just because he was protecting us." From the basement came the sound of something heavy being moved, followed by Detective Walsh's voice. "We need the forensics team down here immediately, and call the district attorney's office. They're going to want to see this." The front door opened to admit more officials, people in suits who moved with the gravity of those dealing with crimes that would make headlines. Rebecca recognized the weight of their presence. Whatever David had done in that basement was worse than anyone had initially imagined. Dr. Sarah Monroe from the hospital arrived with the medical team that would transport Caroline. Rebecca had met Dr. Monroe before, during the dark days after Thomas's death, when Caroline had struggled with depression and Rebecca had worried that she might lose the only parent she had left. "How is she?" Rebecca asked as Dr. Monroe emerged from the basement consultation with the paramedics. Dr. Monroe's expression was carefully controlled, but Rebecca could see the anger burning behind her professional composure. "Your mother is very strong, Rebecca. She's going to need time to recover, but she's fighting, and that's what matters most right now." What Dr. Monroe didn't say, what Rebecca could read in the tight set of her jaw and the way she avoided direct eye contact, was that Caroline's condition was far worse than anyone wanted to admit to a 9-year-old girl. "The equipment down there," Lisa said quietly to Dr. Monroe, pitching her voice low enough that she thought Rebecca couldn't hear. "How long would someone have to be subjected to that kind of treatment to show the symptoms we're seeing?" "Months," Dr. Monroe replied, her voice carrying a note of barely controlled fury. This wasn't a single incident or even a series of isolated attacks. This was systematic, calculated psychological destruction conducted by someone with extensive knowledge of neurology and cognitive therapy. Rebecca felt sick as she realized that every one of David's supposed client sessions in the basement had actually been torture sessions with her mother. Every night that David had claimed to be helping troubled individuals work through their trauma, he had actually been conducting illegal experiments on Caroline's mind. Detective Walsh emerged from the basement, his expression grim. Behind him came 2 technicians carrying what looked like sophisticated medical equipment. Machines that belonged in hospitals, not in suburban basements. "Rebecca," Detective Walsh said, settling into a chair across from her with the careful movements of someone delivering life-changing news. "I need to explain what we found downstairs, because it's going to be important for you to understand as we move forward with this case." Rebecca straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I want to know everything." Detective Walsh glanced at Lisa, who nodded encouragingly. "The basement contains what can only be described as an illegal medical facility designed for psychological manipulation. There are restraint systems, electroshock equipment, and machines designed to administer controlled doses of psychiatric medications without proper medical supervision." Rebecca's stomach lurched, but she forced herself to listen. "What was he doing to Mama?" "Based on the evidence and your mother's initial medical evaluation, it appears David was using a combination of drug therapy and electroshock treatments to interfere with her memory formation and recall. Essentially, he was trying to erase specific memories while reinforcing others." "The memories about him being my real father," Rebecca said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "He wanted Mama to remember that part, but forget everything else. Forget how he abandoned us. Forget how Thomas saved us. Forget why she was afraid of him." "That's exactly right." Detective Walsh's voice carried a note of admiration for Rebecca's quick understanding. "But we also found something else down there that's going to be crucial evidence." He produced a thick, leather-bound journal from an evidence bag. David kept detailed records of every session, every treatment, every step of his plan. He documented everything: his methods, his goals, and his timeline for achieving them. Rebecca stared at the journal, recognizing David's precise handwriting on the visible pages. "What did he write?" "He wrote about finding you and your mother after Thomas's death. He wrote about planning Thomas's car accident. He wrote about his courtship strategy with Caroline and his plans for integrating himself into your family." Detective Walsh paused, clearly struggling with how much to share with a child. "And he wrote about his ultimate goal of legally claiming custody of you once Caroline was declared mentally incompetent." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. David hadn't just wanted to destroy Caroline. He had wanted to do it in a way that would give him complete legal control over Rebecca. If his plan had succeeded, Rebecca would have been placed in the custody of her mother's loving stepfather, while Caroline was institutionalized for mental illness. But that's not the worst part, Detective Walsh continued, his voice gentle but firm. The journal entries from the past month indicate that David was accelerating his timeline. He was planning to eliminate Caroline entirely within the next few weeks. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. Eliminate her? The journal contains detailed plans for staging Caroline's suicide, complete with a note explaining her depression and mental instability. He had already begun preparing the legal paperwork that would grant him emergency custody of you in the event of Caroline's death. The living room seemed to spin around Rebecca as the full scope of David's plan became clear. He had orchestrated every aspect of their lives for months, playing the role of loving stepfather while systematically destroying Caroline's mind and planning her murder. And through it all, he had been building a legal case for himself as Rebecca's devoted guardian. Rebecca, Lisa said gently, I want you to understand that none of this was your fault. David is a very sick man who spent years planning these crimes. There was nothing you or your mother could have done to prevent him from targeting your family. But Rebecca barely heard the reassurance. She was thinking about all the times David had been alone with Caroline, all the nights he had claimed to be working late in his basement office, all the mornings when Caroline had seemed confused and disoriented. She was thinking about Caroline's weight loss, her increasing anxiety, her growing dependence on David's guidance and support. Most of all, she was thinking about how close David had come to succeeding. What happens now? Rebecca asked, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. Now we make sure David can never hurt you or your mother again, Detective Walsh said with quiet intensity. The evidence we've collected tonight is enough to charge him with attempted murder, aggravated assault, practicing medicine without a license, and conspiracy to commit murder. When we factor in Thomas's death and the evidence in that journal, he's looking at multiple life sentences. But even as Detective Walsh spoke with confidence about justice and legal consequences, Rebecca couldn't shake the memory of David's satisfied expression as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists. He had looked like a man whose plan was proceeding exactly as he had intended. What if he gets out? Rebecca asked. What if he finds a way to make people believe his story about Mama being crazy? That's not going to happen, Detective Walsh assured her. The medical evidence alone is enough to prove what he was doing to your mother. No competent lawyer or judge will accept his claims about providing legitimate therapy. The sound of the ambulance gurney being wheeled up from the basement interrupted their conversation. Rebecca caught a glimpse of Caroline strapped to the stretcher, her face pale and her eyes closed, surrounded by medical equipment and concerned paramedics. She looked so small and fragile, nothing like the strong, vibrant woman who had raised Rebecca with such fierce protectiveness. Can I go with her? Rebecca asked, starting to rise from her chair. The doctors need space to work right now, Dr. Monroe said gently. But I promise you'll be able to see her very soon. She's going to the best psychiatric facility in the state, where they specialize in helping people recover from exactly this kind of trauma. As the ambulance disappeared into the night with its precious cargo, Rebecca was left alone with the realization that her childhood, whatever remained of it, was over. The little girl who had worried about homework and friends and normal 9-year-old problems had been replaced by someone who understood that monsters were real, that they could live in your house and eat at your table and convince the world that they loved you. But that little girl had also discovered that she was stronger than she had ever imagined. Strong enough to make the phone call that saved her mother's life. Strong enough to face the truth about her family's history. Strong enough to look evil in the face and refuse to be intimidated by it. As Detective Walsh continued documenting the crime scene and Lisa made arrangements for Rebecca's temporary placement with Caroline's sister, Rebecca made a silent promise to her unconscious mother and her murdered father. David might have stolen months of their lives and years of their peace, but he would not win. Whatever came next, whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever long road to recovery stretched before them, Rebecca would face it with the knowledge that love was stronger than manipulation, truth was more powerful than lies, and sometimes a 9-year-old girl's courage was enough to bring down a monster. The basement laboratory was being dismantled piece by piece, its instruments of torture catalogued as evidence in what would become one of the most shocking criminal cases in Massachusetts history. But upstairs, in the living room where David had once played the role of devoted stepfather, Rebecca Ashford sat wrapped in a blanket and began the long process of reclaiming her life from the man who had tried to steal it. 3 days after the arrest, Rebecca sat in the sterile waiting room of Brookhaven Psychiatric Institute, her small hands folded in her lap as she waited for permission to see her mother. The past 72 hours had passed in a blur of police interviews, social worker visits, and staying with Aunt Patricia, Caroline's younger sister who had driven up from New York City the moment she received the devastating phone call. Patricia Ashford Williams was everything Caroline had once been: vibrant, confident, and fiercely protective. But as she sat beside Rebecca in the uncomfortable plastic chairs, her usual composure was cracked with barely contained rage at what David had done to her sister. "The doctor said Mama's been asking for me," Rebecca said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the past 20 minutes. "She has been," Patricia confirmed, reaching over to squeeze Rebecca's hand. "Dr. Martinez says your mother's memory is starting to return in fragments. The treatments David gave her, they scrambled her brain chemistry, but the human mind is remarkably resilient. She's fighting her way back to us." Through the reinforced glass windows of the waiting room, Rebecca could see the secure garden where patients were allowed to take supervised walks. It was a pleasant space, designed to feel more like a park than a medical facility, but the subtle presence of security cameras and locked gates reminded everyone that this was a place for people whose minds had been damaged in ways that required careful healing. Miss Ashford, a middle-aged woman in a white coat, approached them with a kind but serious expression. "I'm Dr. Elena Martinez, your mother's primary psychiatrist. I've been working with her since she arrived, and I think she's ready to see you now." Rebecca stood up quickly, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "Is she better? Does she remember me?" Dr. Martinez knelt down to Rebecca's eye level, her expression gentle but honest. "Your mother has been through something called systematic psychological trauma. The treatments Mr. Brennan subjected her to were designed to interfere with her memory formation and recall. She remembers you, sweetheart, but there are still gaps. Important things that she's working to piece back together." "Like what?" Rebecca asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. "She remembers loving you and protecting you, but she's having trouble remembering specific events from the past year. She knows David hurt her, but the details are fragmented. Most importantly, she's having difficulty trusting her own perceptions. One of the cruelest aspects of what was done to her is that she was made to doubt her own mind." Patricia's jaw tightened with anger. "How long will it take for her to recover fully?" "Recovery from this type of psychological abuse is a long process," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "With proper treatment and support, we expect to see significant improvement over the next several months. But Caroline will likely always carry some scars from what she endured." Rebecca nodded, trying to process this information with the maturity that trauma had forced upon her. "Can I see her now?" Dr. Martinez led them through a series of locked doors and down a corridor lined with artwork created by patients in art therapy. Caroline's room was at the end of the hall, a private space with a view of the garden and furnished more like a hotel room than a hospital. Caroline was sitting by the window when they entered, her auburn hair clean and brushed but hanging limply around a face that looked years older than it should. When she saw Rebecca, her expression transformed with a joy so profound that it brought tears to everyone's eyes. "Rebecca," Caroline whispered, opening her arms. "My beautiful, brave girl." Rebecca ran to her mother, burying her face against Caroline's shoulder and breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the clinical smell of medical soap. For the first time in days, she felt truly safe. "I was so scared, Mama," Rebecca said, her voice muffled against Caroline's hospital gown. "I thought he might have hurt you so badly that you wouldn't come back to me." Caroline held her daughter tightly, her own tears falling freely. "I'm here, baby. I'm still fighting my way back, but I'm here. And I remember the most important thing. I remember how much I love you." They sat together on Caroline's bed while Patricia settled into the visitor's chair, and for a few minutes, they just held each other in silence. But Rebecca could feel the tremor in her mother's hands and see the confusion that flickered across her face when she tried to focus on specific memories. "Mama," Rebecca said carefully, "do you remember what David did to you?" Caroline's expression grew distant and troubled. "Pieces. I remember being afraid, and I remember pain, but it's like trying to remember a nightmare. The harder I try to focus on the details, the more they slip away." "The doctors say that's normal," Patricia interjected. "Your brain is protecting itself by blocking out the worst memories." "But I need to remember," Caroline said with sudden intensity. "The police keep asking me questions about David's plans, about things he said, about evidence they found in his journal. They need me to testify about what he did. But how can I testify about things I can't clearly remember?" Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing the reunion, stepped forward. "Caroline, we've discussed this. Your testimony is just one part of the case against David Brennan. The physical evidence, Rebecca's account, and David's own documented plans provide a very strong foundation for prosecution." Rebecca looked between the adults, sensing an undercurrent of worry that they weren't sharing with her. "Is there a problem with the case against David?" Patricia and Dr. Martinez exchanged a glance that confirmed Rebecca's suspicions. "Rebecca," Patricia said carefully, "David has hired a very expensive legal team. They're claiming that Caroline's memory problems make her an unreliable witness, and they're arguing that David was providing legitimate therapy to a mentally ill patient." Rebecca felt her blood turn cold. "But that's not true. The equipment in the basement is exactly the kind of equipment used in legitimate psychiatric treatment," Dr. Martinez said grimly. "David's lawyers are arguing that he was providing experimental therapy with Caroline's consent, and that her current condition is the result of her underlying mental illness, not abuse." The full horror of David's plan was becoming clear. He hadn't just tortured Caroline. He had done it in a way that would make it impossible for her to credibly testify against him. By damaging her memory and mental state, he had created reasonable doubt about her reliability as a witness. "But I heard him," Rebecca said urgently. "I heard him confess to killing Thomas and planning to kill Mama. I heard him say terrible things about owning me because he's my biological father. And your testimony will be crucial," Patricia assured her. "But David's lawyers are going to argue that a 9-year-old child might have misunderstood what she heard, especially in a traumatic situation." Caroline's face went white. "Biological father? What are you talking about?" The room fell silent as everyone realized that Caroline's damaged memory had erased one of the most crucial pieces of the puzzle. She didn't remember that David was Rebecca's biological father, the central motivation for everything he had done. "Mama," Rebecca said gently, taking Caroline's hands in hers, "David is my real father. From before Thomas. He abandoned us when you were pregnant, and Thomas married you to protect us. But David came back after Thomas died because he wanted to claim me." Caroline stared at Rebecca with growing horror as fragments of suppressed memories began to surface. "The dreams," she whispered. "I've been having dreams about a man who looked like David, but younger, angrier. He was yelling about not wanting a baby, about me trying to trap him." "Those aren't dreams, Caroline," Dr. Martinez said softly. "Those are memories that are starting to return." Caroline pressed her hands to her temples, her face contorting with the effort of trying to remember. "He killed Thomas. He actually killed Thomas to get to Rebecca." "Yes," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite her tears. "And he was going to kill you too, once he didn't need you anymore." The weight of this revelation settled over Caroline like a physical blow. She looked at Rebecca with a mixture of love and terror, as if seeing her daughter clearly for the first time in months. "All this time," Caroline whispered, "I thought I was going crazy. I thought the confusion and memory problems were because I was weak, because I couldn't handle Thomas's death and the stress of a new marriage. But David was making me sick. He was poisoning my mind." "He's still trying to poison people's minds," Patricia said grimly. His legal team has already started a media campaign portraying him as a dedicated therapist who was trying to help his mentally ill wife, only to be falsely accused by a traumatized child. Rebecca felt a familiar surge of the anger that had sustained her through the worst moments of the past few days. We can't let him win. We can't let him make people think Mama is crazy and I'm lying. We won't, Dr. Martinez said firmly. The medical evidence is overwhelming. The systematic nature of Caroline's injuries, the specific pattern of memory loss, the illegal equipment found in his basement. It all supports your account of what happened. But will it be enough? Caroline asked, her voice small and frightened. Before anyone could answer, Patricia's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. She read it quickly, her expression shifting to one of grim satisfaction. That was Detective Walsh, she announced. They've made a breakthrough in Thomas's case. The forensics team found evidence of sabotage in the wreckage of his car. Evidence that matches tools found in David's basement workshop. Rebecca felt a surge of hope. They can prove David killed Thomas? It looks that way. And there's more. They've traced David's movements for the 6 months before he, coincidentally, met Caroline again. He had been systematically researching your family, learning your routines, identifying vulnerabilities. The premeditation is undeniable. Caroline closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the scope of David's deception. He played the perfect grieving widower's savior. He knew exactly what I needed to hear, exactly how to make me feel safe and protected, because he had been studying us like laboratory rats, Rebecca said, the adult understanding in her voice startling the grown-ups around her. He knew Mama was lonely and scared, and he knew I missed having a father. He used our love against us. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly at Rebecca's insight. Understanding that David's manipulation wasn't your fault is crucial for both of you. He's a predator who spent years planning these crimes. No one could have seen through his deception. But I did see through it, Rebecca said quietly. Part of me always knew something was wrong. I should have trusted my instincts sooner. You trusted them when it mattered most, Caroline said, pulling Rebecca close again. You saved both our lives when you made that phone call. As they sat together in the hospital room, surrounded by the evidence of David's cruelty, but also by the love that had survived it, Rebecca began to understand that their battle was far from over. David might be in jail, but his final weapon was the justice system itself. The same system that was supposed to protect them might be manipulated into setting him free. But Rebecca also understood something else. She wasn't the same frightened child who had hidden in a pantry closet 3 nights ago. She had looked evil in the face and refused to be silenced. She had found her voice in the darkest moment of her life, and she would use it to make sure David never hurt anyone else. The little girl who had believed in fairy tale families was gone forever, but in her place was someone stronger. Someone who knew that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. 6 weeks after David's arrest, Rebecca sat in the witness preparation room of the Suffolk County Courthouse, her small legs swinging from the adult-sized chair as Assistant District Attorney Catherine Blake reviewed her testimony one final time. The preliminary hearing was scheduled to begin in an hour, and Rebecca could feel the weight of justice pressing down on her 9-year-old shoulders like a physical force. Remember, Rebecca, Catherine said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had prosecuted family violence cases for over a decade. David's lawyer is going to try to confuse you. He's going to suggest that you misunderstood what you heard that night, or that your fear made you imagine things that didn't happen. But all you have to do is tell the truth exactly as you remember it. Rebecca nodded solemnly, her hands folded in her lap. She had grown up considerably in the past month and a half. Not just in the way that trauma forces premature maturity, but in her understanding of how the world really worked. She had learned that telling the truth wasn't always enough, that evil people could hire smart lawyers to twist reality until blacks seemed white and victims seemed like perpetrators. What if the judge doesn't believe me? Rebecca asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping her awake at night. Judge Morrison has been on the bench for 20 years, Catherine assured her. She's seen every kind of manipulation and deception that exists. She'll know the truth when she hears it. Through the window of the preparation room, Rebecca could see the media circus that had formed outside the courthouse. David's case had become a sensation. The respected therapist accused of torturing his wife and plotting to murder his stepdaughter had captured the public's imagination in the worst possible way. Some reporters were calling him a monster, but others were questioning whether a grieving widow and traumatized child could be trusted to distinguish between reality and imagination. "Is Mama ready to testify?" Rebecca asked, though she already knew the answer would be complicated. Catherine's expression grew carefully neutral. "Your mother has made remarkable progress in her recovery, but Dr. Martinez feels that testifying in open court might be too traumatic for her current mental state. We're going to rely primarily on the medical evidence of her injuries and the recordings of her initial police interviews." What Catherine didn't say, but what Rebecca understood anyway, was that Caroline's damaged memory and fragile psychological state made her a liability on the witness stand. David's lawyers would tear her apart, using her confusion and memory gaps to support their narrative that she was a mentally ill woman who had imagined most of her abuse. "Rebecca." Patricia appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. She had taken a leave of absence from her job in New York to support Caroline and Rebecca through the legal proceedings, and the stress was showing in the new lines around her eyes. "It's time." The courtroom was smaller than Rebecca had expected from television shows, but it felt enormous as she walked through the doors and saw the assembled crowd of lawyers, reporters, and observers. David sat at the defendant's table with his legal team, 3 expensive suits who had spent the past 6 weeks constructing an elaborate fiction about his innocence. When Rebecca saw David for the first time since his arrest, she was struck by how different he looked. Gone was the perfectly groomed stepfather who had sat at their dinner table making pleasant conversation. This David was thinner, his hair unkempt, his eyes carrying a hollow intensity that made Rebecca's skin crawl. But when their eyes met across the courtroom, his expression shifted into something that chilled her to the bone. A look of paternal disappointment, as if she were a naughty child who had told tales about something she didn't understand. Judge Morrison was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had clearly read all the case materials thoroughly, because her first questions to the prosecution were pointed and specific. "Counselor Blake," Judge Morrison began, "this court understands that the defendant is accused of systematic psychological abuse, conspiracy to commit murder, and the actual murder of Thomas Ashford. These are extraordinarily serious charges. I trust you have extraordinary evidence to support them." "We do, Your Honor," Catherine replied, rising with the confidence of someone who had built an unshakable case. "The evidence will show that David Brennan orchestrated a multi-year plan to claim custody of his biological daughter by murdering her adoptive father and psychologically destroying her mother." David's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Pierce who charged more per hour than most people made in a month, immediately objected. "Your Honor, the prosecution is characterizing alleged events in a way that presupposes guilt. My client is a licensed family therapist who was providing innovative treatment to his mentally ill wife. The tragic misunderstanding that led to these charges stems from a disturbed child's misinterpretation of legitimate medical procedures." Rebecca felt her face burn with anger at being called disturbed, but Catherine had prepared her for this. David's entire defense strategy was based on portraying Rebecca as an unreliable witness and Caroline as a mentally ill woman who couldn't distinguish between reality and delusion. "The prosecution will present its case," Judge Morrison said firmly, "and the defense will have its opportunity to respond. Mr. Pierce, your client's professional credentials don't immunize him from criminal charges if the evidence supports them." The first witness was Detective Walsh, who methodically presented the physical evidence found in David's basement laboratory. The photographs of the illegal medical equipment were projected on screens around the courtroom, and Rebecca heard several spectators gasp at the images of restraint systems and electroshock devices that belonged in a torture chamber, not a therapy office. "Detective Walsh," Catherine asked, "in your professional opinion, was this equipment designed for legitimate psychiatric treatment?" "Absolutely not," Detective Walsh replied firmly. "This equipment was modified to operate without the safety protocols required for medical use. The restraint systems were designed to prevent escape, not to ensure patient safety." This was a facility designed for systematic torture disguised as therapy. David's attorney immediately cross-examined Detective Walsh, focusing on the detective's lack of medical training and suggesting that he was unqualified to judge the legitimacy of psychiatric equipment. But Detective Walsh had prepared for this line of attack, producing expert testimony from 3 independent psychiatrists who had examined the basement setup and unanimously concluded that it was designed for abuse, not treatment. The prosecution's medical expert, Dr. James Rodriguez from Harvard Medical School, took the stand next. His testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. The pattern of injuries we observed in Caroline Ashford is consistent with systematic psychological torture, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the court. The specific combination of pharmaceutical interventions and electroshock treatments was designed to interfere with memory formation while increasing psychological dependence on the abuser. This wasn't therapy, it was methodical brainwashing. Dr. Rodriguez, Catherine continued, could these injuries have been self-inflicted or the result of consensual medical treatment? Impossible, Dr. Rodriguez replied without hesitation. The neurological damage we observed could only have been caused by prolonged systematic abuse. No legitimate medical professional would ever administer these treatments without proper supervision and safeguards. David's attorney tried to challenge Dr. Rodriguez's findings, but the medical evidence was overwhelming. Brain scans showed specific patterns of damage consistent with forced electroshock therapy. Blood tests revealed traces of psychiatric medications that had never been prescribed by Caroline's regular doctor, and physical evidence documented months of systematic abuse. Then came the moment Rebecca had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Catherine called her name, and she walked to the witness stand on trembling legs, acutely aware that every person in the courtroom was watching her with varying degrees of sympathy, skepticism, and curiosity. Judge Morrison looked down at Rebecca with kindness but also gravity. Rebecca, do you understand that you're here to tell the truth about what happened in your house? Yes, Your Honor, Rebecca replied, her voice clear despite her nerves. And do you understand the difference between telling the truth and telling a story? Yes, Your Honor. The truth is what really happened, even if it's scary or hard to believe. Catherine began with gentle questions about Rebecca's family life before David arrived, establishing the loving relationship she had shared with Thomas and Caroline. Rebecca spoke about Thomas's kindness, his dedication to her and Caroline, and the stability he had provided during the most important years of her childhood. Rebecca, when David first came into your family's life, how did you feel about him? Rebecca considered this carefully. At first, I wanted to like him because Mama seemed happy, but something always felt wrong. He said the right things and did the right things, but it felt like he was acting in a play. Can you give the court an example of what you mean? He would ask me about school, but he never remembered my answers. He would say he loved me, but his eyes looked cold. And he was always watching Mama like he was studying her. David's attorney objected that Rebecca was offering speculation rather than factual testimony, but Judge Morrison allowed the testimony to continue, noting that a child's perceptions of adult behavior could be relevant evidence. Catherine moved carefully through the timeline of David's integration into their family, the gradual changes in Caroline's behavior, and the increasing restrictions and rules that had transformed their home into something that felt more like a prison. Rebecca, I want you to tell the court about the night you called 911. What did you hear that made you feel your mother was in danger? Rebecca took a deep breath and began to recount the events of that terrible night. She spoke about hearing Caroline's screams from the basement, about the things David had said about Thomas's murder, about his claims of ownership over Rebecca, and about his plans to eliminate Caroline once she was no longer useful. He said Thomas was a complication that needed to be resolved. Rebecca testified, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. He said the brake failure was regrettable but necessary. He said I belonged to him because he was my biological father, and that Mama couldn't protect me anymore. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Rebecca continued her testimony, describing David's cold confession to murder and his detailed plans for Caroline's death. Her words carried the ring of absolute truth, too specific and too horrifying to be the invention of a child's imagination. David's attorney's cross-examination was brutal but carefully controlled. He couldn't attack Rebecca too aggressively without appearing to bully a child, but he systematically tried to undermine her credibility. Rebecca, isn't it true that you had been seeing a psychiatrist because of behavioral problems? I was seeing Dr. Vance because I was sad about my daddy Thomas dying, Rebecca corrected firmly. And isn't it true that you had been having dreams and episodes where you became confused about reality? I was having memories about David being there when I was very little. They seemed like dreams because I was too young to understand them at the time. Rebecca, when you heard what you believed to be your mother's screams that night, isn't it possible that you were having another one of these episodes? That you imagined things that didn't really happen? Rebecca looked directly at David as she answered, her voice steady and clear. I know what I heard. David confessed to killing my daddy Thomas, and he was torturing my mama to make her forget the truth about who he really was. I didn't imagine any of it. The attorney tried several more approaches, suggesting that Rebecca had been influenced by adult conversations, that she had misunderstood therapeutic procedures, that her trauma had distorted her memories. But Rebecca's testimony remained consistent and unshakable. She had heard what she had heard, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change that fundamental truth. When Rebecca stepped down from the witness stand, she felt like she had aged another year in the space of 2 hours. But she also felt something else, a sense of completion, as if she had finally been able to speak for Thomas, for Caroline, and for herself in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The prosecution's final piece of evidence was David's own journal, read aloud by Catherine in David's precise handwriting. The entries documented his systematic planning of Thomas's murder, his careful manipulation of Caroline's grief, his detailed observations of Rebecca's routines and vulnerabilities, and his timeline for achieving complete control over both of them. Month 6. Caroline's resistance is weakening as expected. The memory treatments are having the desired effect. She questions her own perceptions more frequently and relies increasingly on my guidance. Rebecca remains suspicious, but lacks the cognitive framework to articulate her concerns effectively. Month 7. Accelerating the timeline. Caroline's mental degradation is progressing faster than anticipated. May need to implement the final solution sooner than planned to avoid unwanted attention from medical professionals. Month 8. Rebecca's dreams are becoming more frequent. The child's mind is attempting to process suppressed memories of our previous relationship. This development is concerning but manageable. Once Caroline is eliminated, Rebecca will have no choice but to accept her true family situation. The journal entries were devastating in their clinical detachment. David had documented his crimes with the same methodical precision he brought to his legitimate therapy practice, creating an unshakable record of premeditation and malice. As the prosecution rested its case, Rebecca looked around the courtroom and saw that the atmosphere had shifted. The skepticism that had greeted the initial charges had been replaced by something else: horror at the scope of David's deception, and admiration for the courage of a 9-year-old girl who had refused to be silenced. David's defense attorney called several character witnesses, colleagues who testified to David's professional competence and dedication to his patients. But their testimony felt hollow against the weight of the physical evidence and Rebecca's unshakable account of what she had witnessed. When David himself took the stand in his own defense, Rebecca watched with fascination as he attempted to reconstruct his carefully crafted persona. He spoke about his love for Caroline and Rebecca, his dedication to helping troubled families, and his heartbreak at being misunderstood by the very people he had tried to save. But something had changed in David during his weeks in custody. The polished facade that had fooled so many people for so long was cracking under the pressure of exposure. His answers were too rehearsed, his emotions too calculated, his explanations too convenient. Even without Rebecca's testimony, it would have been clear to anyone paying attention that David was performing rather than genuinely responding. Mr. Brennan, the prosecutor asked during cross-examination, how do you explain the forensic evidence linking you to Thomas Ashford's car accident? I have no explanation for that evidence, David replied smoothly. I can only assume that someone is attempting to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. And the illegal medical equipment found in your basement? I was providing innovative therapy to my wife using techniques I had developed through years of research. The modifications to the equipment were designed to enhance its therapeutic effectiveness. Without proper medical supervision or informed consent, Caroline was fully aware of and consented to her treatment regimen. But when Catherine asked David to explain specific entries from his journal, particularly his detailed plans for Caroline's suicide and his timeline for gaining custody of Rebecca, his composure finally cracked. "Those journal entries have been taken out of context," David said, his voice rising with frustration. "They represent therapeutic hypotheses, not criminal plans. Mr. Brennan, you wrote, and I quote, 'The final solution must appear to be Caroline's own decision. The suicide note has been drafted to reflect her increasing despair over her mental illness. Rebecca will need immediate placement with a stable guardian, namely her biological father.' How is that a therapeutic hypothesis?" David's mask slipped completely for just a moment, and Rebecca saw the cold rage that had always lurked beneath his professional demeanor. "Rebecca is my daughter," he said, his voice carrying a possessive intensity that made several jury members recoil. "She belongs with me, not with whatever substitute Caroline might have chosen next." The courtroom erupted in murmurs at this admission, and Judge Morrison had to call for order. In trying to justify his actions, David had confirmed everything Rebecca had testified about. His sense of ownership over her, his view of Thomas as an obstacle to be eliminated, and his complete lack of regard for Caroline's rights as a mother. When the defense rested its case, Rebecca knew that they had won. Not just the legal battle, but something more important, the right to define their own story rather than accepting David's version of reality. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and unequivocal. David Brennan was bound over for trial on charges of first-degree murder, attempted murder, aggravated assault, practicing medicine without a license, and conspiracy to commit murder. His bail was denied, and he was remanded to custody pending trial. As the court officers led David away in handcuffs, he turned one last time to look at Rebecca. But instead of the paternal disappointment or cold rage she expected, his expression was something else entirely. A calculating look that suggested this was merely a setback, not a defeat. Rebecca shivered as she realized that even now, even facing life in prison, David still believed he could find a way to win. The man who had spent years manipulating everyone around him wasn't ready to accept that his carefully constructed reality had finally collapsed. But as Patricia wrapped her arms around Rebecca and Catherine congratulated them on their courage, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. They had faced the monster and exposed him for what he really was. Whatever came next, whatever legal battles still lay ahead, they had proven that truth was stronger than manipulation and love was more powerful than possession. The little girl who had hidden in a pantry closet and whispered into a phone for help was gone forever. In her place stood someone who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you could do was refuse to stay silent, even when the whole world seemed determined to make you disappear. 18 months after David's conviction on all charges and sentencing to life in prison without the possibility of parole, Rebecca stood in the doorway of their new home in Burlington, Vermont, watching Caroline tend to the small garden they had planted together in the spring. The house was nothing like their old colonial in Westfield. It was smaller, older, and had quirks that required patience rather than perfection. But it was theirs in a way that the previous house had never been, even before David's arrival had poisoned it with his presence. Caroline looked up from the tomato plants she was carefully staking, her face carrying a peace that Rebecca hadn't seen since before Thomas's death. The past year and a half of intensive therapy had worked remarkable changes in her mother, not erasing the scars left by David's systematic abuse, but helping her reclaim her identity as someone stronger than her trauma. "The cherry tomatoes are going to be ready soon," Caroline called out, wiping dirt from her hands on her old gardening apron. "Want to help me check on the peppers?" Rebecca smiled and stepped out into the warm afternoon sunshine, still marveling at how normal conversations about vegetables could feel like small miracles after everything they had survived. The Vermont summer was gentler than the humid Massachusetts heat they had left behind, and their new neighbors were the kind of people who brought fresh bread when someone moved in and minded their own business about why a mother and daughter might want to start over somewhere new. "Mama," Rebecca said as they knelt together among the pepper plants, "Dr. Vance thinks I'm ready to stop seeing her regularly." She says my nightmares have decreased enough that we can move to monthly check-ins instead of weekly sessions. Caroline paused in her examination of a particularly promising bell pepper, her expression thoughtful. How do you feel about that? Are you ready? It was a question Caroline asked frequently now, not just accepting Rebecca's surface responses, but genuinely wanting to understand her daughter's emotional state. The mother who had once been so focused on protecting Rebecca that she hadn't always listened to her had been replaced by someone who understood that protection and communication were not mutually exclusive. I think so, Rebecca replied honestly. The dreams are different now. When I dream about David, he's behind bars where he belongs. When I dream about Thomas, he's proud of us for being brave. Caroline reached over to squeeze Rebecca's hand. Her eyes bright with tears she no longer tried to hide. The Caroline who had emerged from her own recovery was more emotionally present than she had been even before David's manipulation, as if learning to trust her own perceptions again had freed her to trust her feelings as well. Thomas would be proud of us, Caroline agreed. He would be amazed by how strong you've become. Rebecca was indeed stronger, though not in the ways that trauma typically changes children. She hadn't become hardened or cynical. Instead, she had developed an unusual ability to see through people's facades to their true intentions. She could spot manipulation from across a room, recognize genuine kindness when she encountered it, and distinguish between people who meant what they said and people who were performing. Mrs. Henderson from next door asked if I'd be interested in babysitting her grandson when he visits this summer, Rebecca said, carefully transplanting a pepper seedling that had outgrown its original container. She said, I'm more mature than most 12-year-olds. Rebecca was indeed 12 now, having celebrated 2 birthdays since the night she saved her mother's life. But her maturity went beyond her years in ways that sometimes worried Caroline, even as she was proud of her daughter's resilience. What did you tell her? Caroline asked. I said I'd think about it. I like kids, but sometimes I worry that I'll see danger where there isn't any. What if I can't tell the difference between a normal adult being friendly with children and someone who might hurt them? It was a fair concern, and Caroline appreciated that Rebecca could articulate it so clearly. One of the unexpected challenges of their recovery had been learning to navigate a world where most people were actually trustworthy, most situations were actually safe, and most kindness was actually genuine. You know, Caroline said thoughtfully, I think your ability to spot genuine threats is one of your greatest strengths. But you're right that you'll need to learn when to trust that ability and when to give people the benefit of the doubt. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, tending to plants that represented growth and renewal in ways that went far beyond gardening. Caroline had thrown herself into creating life, flowers, vegetables, herbs that filled their new home with fresh scents and vibrant colors. It was, Rebecca understood, her mother's way of proving to herself that she could nurture and create instead of merely surviving. Rebecca, Caroline said eventually, her voice carrying a tone that Rebecca recognized as the prelude to a serious conversation. I got a letter from the victim's advocate yesterday. David's lawyers are filing an appeal. Rebecca's hands stilled on the soil, but she felt only a mild tightness in her chest rather than the panic such news would have induced a year ago. What kind of appeal? They're claiming that his trial attorney was incompetent and that new evidence has emerged that might exonerate him. Caroline's voice was steady, but Rebecca could hear the underlying tension. Catherine Blake says it's a standard move for someone facing a life sentence, and that the chances of success are virtually zero. But not actually zero, Rebecca observed. No, Caroline admitted. Not actually zero. Rebecca considered this information with the careful analytical thinking that had become her default response to potential threats. What would happen if somehow his appeal succeeded? He would get a new trial. But Rebecca, the evidence against him is overwhelming. His own journal, the medical testimony, the forensic evidence from Thomas's car, none of that has changed. And you're older now, more articulate. If you had to testify again, you'd be even more credible than you were at 11. Rebecca nodded, understanding the practical aspects of the situation. But she also understood something else, something that Caroline was trying not to acknowledge because it was too frightening to voice. He's still trying to control us, isn't he? Rebecca said quietly. Even from prison, He's still trying to make us afraid. Caroline's silence was answer enough. Mama, Rebecca continued, I need to tell you something that I figured out a while ago but wasn't sure how to say. Caroline set down her gardening tools and gave Rebecca her full attention. Another change from the scattered, anxious woman David had created through months of psychological torture. I think David planned for the possibility of getting caught, Rebecca said. I think he always had backup plans, ways to continue controlling us even if his first plan failed. What makes you think that? The way he looked at me in the courtroom after he was convicted. He wasn't angry or defeated. He looked satisfied, like everything was still going according to plan. Rebecca pulled a stubborn weed from between the pepper plants, her movements deliberate and controlled. I think he knew that even if he went to prison, the fear would be enough to keep controlling us. Caroline sat back on her heels, studying her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. You're probably right. So what do we do about it? We live our lives, Rebecca said simply. We plant gardens and make friends and do normal things. We don't let the possibility of him manipulating the legal system make us prisoners in our own lives. And if his appeal succeeds? If there's another trial? Rebecca met her mother's eyes with a steadiness that would have been impossible 2 years ago. Then I'll testify again. And I'll keep testifying until everyone understands what kind of man David really is. He can file appeals for the rest of his life, but he can't change what actually happened. Caroline reached over to hug her daughter, marveling at the person Rebecca had become through necessity and choice. When did you become so wise? When I realized that being afraid of David was just another way of letting him win, Rebecca replied. He wants us to spend our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for him to find some way to hurt us again. But we're not the same people we were when he was manipulating us. We're stronger now. As if to underscore Rebecca's point, the mail truck rounded the corner and stopped at their mailbox. Caroline went to collect the day's delivery, returning with the usual mixture of bills, catalogs, and local newsletters. But buried among the mundane correspondence was an envelope that made both Rebecca and Caroline freeze. The return address showed the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, and Caroline's name was written in the precise handwriting they both recognized as David's. He's allowed to send letters? Rebecca asked, her voice carefully controlled. Apparently, Caroline replied, staring at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. The question is whether we want to read it. Rebecca considered this. Everything in her wanted to throw the letter away unopened, to refuse to give David any opportunity to insert his voice into their new life. But another part of her, the part that had learned to face difficult truths rather than hiding from them, was curious about what David might say after 18 months in prison. I think we should read it, Rebecca said finally. Not because we care what he has to say, but because we need to know what he's thinking. Caroline nodded and carefully opened the envelope, unfolding a single sheet of prison stationery covered in David's neat handwriting. They read it together, standing in their garden surrounded by the evidence of their recovery. Dear Caroline and Rebecca, I hope this letter finds you both well and thriving in your new life. I wanted you to know that I've been using my time in prison constructively, working with other inmates who have experienced similar misunderstandings with the legal system. I've also been corresponding with several legal organizations that specialize in cases involving wrongful conviction. I understand that you both believe I committed terrible crimes against our family. I want you to know that I don't blame you for this confusion. Trauma can make people remember things differently than they actually happened, and children especially can be influenced by adult interpretations of events they didn't fully understand. The appeal process is moving forward, and I'm confident that eventually the truth will emerge. When that happens, I hope we can begin to heal as a family. Rebecca, you are still my daughter, regardless of what anyone has told you about your parentage. That biological connection is permanent and unchangeable. I think about you both every day and pray that someday you'll understand that everything I did was motivated by love and a desire to protect our family from forces that wanted to tear us apart. With endless love and hope for reconciliation, David. Rebecca and Caroline stood in silence for several minutes after finishing the letter, processing David's words and the chilling implications behind them. He still doesn't think he did anything wrong, Caroline said finally. "He's still trying to gaslight us," Rebecca observed, using a term she had learned in therapy to describe David's systematic efforts to make them doubt their own perceptions. "He's calling his crimes misunderstandings and suggesting that our memories are wrong. And he's still claiming you as his daughter, still insisting on that biological connection." Rebecca crumpled the letter in her hands, feeling a familiar surge of anger at David's presumption. "Biology doesn't make someone a father. Thomas was my father in every way that mattered. David is just the man who contributed genetic material and then spent years trying to destroy our family." Caroline smiled at Rebecca's fierce clarity. "You're absolutely right. Should we throw this away?" "No," Rebecca said, surprising her mother. "We should give it to Catherine Blake. If David is writing letters like this, he's probably revealing more about his mental state than he realizes. This could actually help the prosecution if there's another trial." Caroline looked at her daughter with renewed amazement. "You're thinking like a prosecutor." "I'm thinking like someone who refuses to be a victim," Rebecca corrected. "David can write all the letters he wants from prison. He can file appeals and claim he was wrongfully convicted and insist that he loves us. But none of that changes what actually happened, and none of it gives him any power over our lives unless we let it." They walked back toward their house together, leaving the garden that represented their new beginning and entering the home that symbolized their safety. The walls were decorated with photographs of their life in Vermont, Rebecca's school concerts, Caroline's book club meetings, holidays spent with Aunt Patricia, quiet moments of healing and growth. There were no photographs of David in their new home. He had been edited out of their story not through denial or avoidance, but through the deliberate choice to define their lives by something other than his impact on them. "Rebecca," Caroline said as they washed the garden soil from their hands at the kitchen sink, "I want you to know how proud I am of the person you've become, not just because you survived what David did to us, but because you chose to become someone stronger and kinder rather than someone harder and more suspicious." Rebecca considered this as she dried her hands on a kitchen towel that featured cheerful sunflowers, so different from the pristine, impersonal linens that had decorated their Westfield home. "I think," Rebecca said slowly, "that David taught me something important without meaning to. He showed me that people can pretend to be anything, loving, caring, trustworthy, while actually being something else entirely. But that also means that when someone shows you genuine kindness or love, it's even more precious because you know the difference." Caroline hugged her daughter tightly, understanding that this wisdom had come at a terrible price but grateful that Rebecca had emerged from their ordeal with her capacity for trust and joy intact. That evening, as they sat together on their front porch watching the Vermont sunset paint their quiet street in shades of gold and amber, Rebecca felt something she had rarely experienced in her 12 years of life: complete peace. Not the absence of challenge or difficulty, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that she had faced the worst kind of evil and emerged not just intact, but stronger. David was in prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. His appeals would fail because truth had a weight that manipulation couldn't overcome. His letters would continue to arrive occasionally, but they would be filed as evidence rather than read as threats. Most importantly, Rebecca had learned that survival wasn't enough, that the goal wasn't just to escape from people like David, but to build a life so full of genuine love and purpose that their toxic influence became irrelevant. "Mama," Rebecca said as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, "do you think Thomas can see us now?" Caroline squeezed her daughter's hand, thinking of the man who had loved them both enough to die protecting them, even though he never knew the danger was coming. "I think," Caroline said softly, "that Thomas would say we turned out exactly the way he hoped we would, strong enough to survive anything, but gentle enough to still believe in goodness." Rebecca nodded, satisfied with this answer. In the distance, she could hear the sound of their neighbors calling their children in for the night, ordinary sounds of ordinary families living ordinary lives. It was a kind of peace she had never thought possible during the dark months when David had controlled their world. But now she understood something that would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Monsters were real, but they were not invincible. Truth was stronger than lies. Love was more powerful than manipulation. And sometimes the most important victory was simply refusing to let evil define your story. The girl who had whispered into a phone for help in a pantry closet was gone forever, but in her place was someone who would never again mistake performance for authenticity, possession for love, or control for protection. Rebecca Ashford had found her voice in the darkness, and she would spend the rest of her life using it to speak for those who couldn't yet speak for themselves.